I'll give just a few preliminary words of introduction before the presentation begins. The presenter, Jack Lewis, is originally from Southwest Pennsylvania, near Morgantown, West Virginia. We're husband and wife, and we're both engineers, but we have been collaborating on book projects as writers and editors for about 30 years. Most of Jack's books have been on engineering and technology topics, but he's written one other historical book on the 1st West Virginia Cavalry in the Civil War. He's been a Civil War history buff on the side for most of his adult life, and about 15 years ago he discovered that one of his great-grandfathers, Alexander J. Sweeney, had been a permanent orderly for General John Buford and was with him at Gettysburg, where General Buford is credited with saving the day and the battle for the Union forces by getting there first and claiming the best high ground for the Union. Jack was intrigued and decided to research and write about that. He thought he was pretty much an expert on the Civil War by this time, but when he discovered that Sweeney, who was a young farmer living in Smithfield, Pennsylvania in 1861 at the start of the war, immediately joined the 1st Virginia Volunteer Cavalry in Morgantown, he was confused. Why did Sweeney join the Confederate cavalry, he thought. After some further research, he finally realized that there were two 1st Virginia cavalry regiments, one Confederate and one Union. The one his great-grandfather joined eventually became the 1st West Virginia Volunteer Cavalry in 1863, when West Virginia became a state. The regiment had been authorized by Francis Pierpont, who was then the governor of the restored government of Virginia. This is the point where I began to get a lot of questions from Jack, since I had grown up in Virginia and gone to college there. "Carol, did you ever hear of the restored government of Virginia?" "No." Then he'd proceed to read me his latest findings on how that had come about. As he got drawn further and further into the history of how West Virginia came to be, he was more and more blown away. At first I doubted what he was telling me, because I thought I pretty much knew everything important about Virginia history, but this story had been swept under the rug and had never been taught to me. I soon became equally fascinated as we both read and came to understand how clever and daring those West Virginia founding fathers were to pull off this complicated birth of a new state during such a time of political upheaval and turmoil. Indeed, they took advantage of the turmoil to get what they had wanted for a very long time, to separate from the eastern counties of Virginia and run their own show as a separate state. Deciding to write the story of West Virginia's complicated birth and his great-grandfather's role as a novel was an interesting decision. Jack is a stickler for historical accuracy, and he was afraid many might see a novel as merely a made-up story. But after much discussion, we both decided a novel would provide an opportunity to really let the readers live through the confusion and turmoil and the dangers that these people faced during that terrible time in our nation's history, and also showcase this fascinating piece of West Virginia history. Jack didn't have much information on Alexander Sweeney other than his military records, and he wanted to understand and try to get inside his head as he joined the cavalry and headed off to fight after his short lifetime of being a farmer. But equally, Jack had become an evangelist for the West Virginia story and told it to pretty much everyone who would listen to him. He wanted his novel to portray that story in all its amazing detail through the hearts and minds of the characters that lived it and made it happen. This presentation, Birth Pains of a State, will focus on why and how West Virginia became a state. Jack's novel, Storm Coming, goes into a lot more detail on this. For example, it covers the battles that were fought in 1861 on the territory that became West Virginia in great detail, but they're only covered briefly in this presentation. Keep in mind that those battles were very important in the Civil War, especially for providing the momentum for statehood. West Virginia definitely had a bloody, chaotic, and complicated birth, and that's what Jack is talking about in this presentation. He's also going to consider the legality and constitutionality of West Virginia statehood from a few different angles. It's interesting that the constitutionality of West Virginia statehood is still debated today. Hope you enjoy this presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carol. Greetings, everyone. I greatly appreciate your being here. Here's a short clip from Three Dog Night. During my research for Storm Coming, I found myself asking this question. As far back as the American Revolution, a new state of Pennsylvania was being considered. A petition to form the state was presented to the Continental Congress on the grounds that the mountains made it an almost impossible barrier to the east. The rugged nature of the county certainly made slavery unprofitable. The population consisted of a variety of immigrants, Germans, Scots, and Irish, to name a few. They came mostly from Pennsylvania, but there were also immigrants from northern states. As time passed, social, political, and economic differences grew between those who lived west of the mountains and those who lived to the eastern side of the mountains. Slavery was a big issue as the new U.S. Constitution was being hammered out in Philadelphia. The southern colonies wanted slaves to be counted when determining a state's total population because the representation in the new lower house of Congress would be based on population. The Southerners wanted to offset the more populous northern states. A compromise, later known as the Three-Fifths Compromise, was proposed. 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted in the population. The compromise was hotly debated, but it was passed. The Three-Fifths Compromise gave the southern states a third more seats in Congress and a third more electoral votes than if the slaves had been ignored. As you can see from this slide showing the distribution of slaves by county, most of the slaves lived in the eastern counties. During the State Constitution Convention of 1829, the slaveholding counties were given the benefit of the Three-Fifths rule in apportioning the state's House of Delegates. In addition, property taxes were less on slaves than other property, causing those counties with few or no slaves to pay proportionately more taxes. To make matters worse, for the folks living in western counties, an unfair rule for voting was proposed by and passed by the eastern majority. A lot of folks living in the western counties were upset over the suffrage qualification, which restricted voting to only white males with 25 acres improved or 50 acres of unimproved land. Many Westerners couldn't vote and openly expressed their desire to secede from Virginia and form a new state. Their objections, however, mattered little, as the new Constitution was easily carried by the Eastern majority. It took almost 20 years of debating and complaining by the western counties before the Easterners took appeasement actions. At first glance, it appears that the Easterners finally came to their senses in the 1850 Constitution Convention. Any white male over 21 was given the right to vote. More western counties were created to increase representation in the House of Delegates. State roads were built over the mountains to improve communications. But on closer examination, Westerners realized the Easterners never lost control of the state. Just when the Western Virginians needed a champion, a great supporter of their cause appeared. In 1856, Archibald Campbell purchased the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, and through his thoughtful editorials and political activities, he influenced many people, including President Lincoln. He truly became one of the founding fathers of the state. In 1860, Lincoln won the presidential election. He had the most electoral votes, but got only 39% of the popular votes. Does that sound familiar? Was his election due to too many candidates? Even if you add the electoral votes for southern-leaning states of Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri to those of the Cotton states, and even with the 3/5 rule, Lincoln would still win the election. Was the election all about money and slavery? Both the North and the South profited from the slave economy, but Lincoln sounded to the Southerners like he would limit slave trade in the new territories. This upset the Cotton states, who looked upon the new U.S. territories as a means of expanding their economies. Cotton was king, and Southern states had the world market. To continue expanding, more land and slaves were needed. These 7 Southern Cotton states seceded from the Union even before Lincoln took office. Note the political cartoon. It shows 2 Southern states seceding by cutting on the wrong side of their limb of the Union tree. A couple of weeks later, on February 13, 1861, Governor Letcher called a session of the state legislature to debate Virginia's position related to secession. This upset the Western County delegates because all former conventions were held only after authorization by a vote of the people. Westerners made it clear that they would take action to form a new state if Virginia seceded. They also complained about the unfair property tax. On April 4th, delegates voted 95 against secession to 45 for secession. So what happened to change their minds? After lengthy negotiations over the presence of a federal fort in the Charleston, South Carolina harbor, to the cheers of South Carolinians, General Beauregard ordered Southern cannons to fire on the federal forces in the Fort Sumter, forcing them to surrender. President Lincoln called an emergency session of Congress. Following the policy set down by President George Washington to put down the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, Lincoln announced a call for 75,000 militiamen, apportioned among all the states who had not already seceded, to suppress the rebellion of the Cotton states. Virginia and 3 other states refused to send militia. Ex-Governor Wise was a radical secessionist who believed Governor Letcher was a Unionist. On April 16, 1861, Wise convinced Captain Turner Ashby, along with others who participated, to lead his Virginia cavalry in an attack on the U.S. Federal Army at Harper's Ferry to capture the arms stored there. Wise did not have permission from Governor Letcher to do this, as Letcher had wanted to wait for the vote of delegates. Early in the morning of April 17th, Wise informed Governor Letcher of his actions that evening. Letcher did nothing. It was too late to stop the attack. As the day's session was being called to order, Wise rose to be recognized. He held a large horse pistol with a long barrel, which he brandished and then laid on his desk. Then he said, in a loud, boisterous voice, "I know that Virginia armed forces are now moving upon Harper's Ferry to capture for the public defense the arms there at the arsenal. There will be a fight or a foot race between our Virginia militia Federal troops before the sun sets this day." Many of the delegates were upset, while others cheered wildly. It was obvious by the look on Letcher's face that Wise had usurped the power and committed an act of war on the federal government. A vote was called after the delegates finally settled down. This time, 88 delegates voted for secession and 55 voted for staying in the Union. The date of May 23, 1861, was set for Virginia citizens to vote yea or nay for the ordinance of secession. Most delegates from the western counties left the convention that night, fearing they would be forbidden to leave the convention if they stayed. Western Virginians were quick to react to the convention's vote for secession. I will read another passage from my book that shows the bravery of Western statesmen and is quite amusing. Colonel Robert E. Lee, who refused command of the federal forces offered to him by President Lincoln, later accepted Governor Letcher's offer of the rank of general and command of all Virginia military forces. After the convention voted for secession, Letcher walked into Lee's office and asked him what action he had taken to defend Western Virginia against invasion from Ohio and Pennsylvania. Lee replied he had taken no action because the citizens of Virginia had not yet voted for the ordinance of secession. Letcher replied, "We are going to have trouble with those people in western counties. I wrote a letter to Andrew Sweeney, mayor of Wheeling, informing him of the passage of the ordinance and ordering him to seize at once the custom house of that city, the post office, and all public buildings and documents in the name of the sovereign state of Virginia." Do you know what he wrote back? Lee replied, "I can only guess, Governor, since we are not a sovereign state unless the people vote in favor of secession on May 23rd, I suspect he said he wouldn't obey." Letcher, now in a huff, replies, "More than that, General Lee. He wrote back, 'I have seized the custom house, the post office, and all the public buildings and documents in the name of Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, whose property they are.'" Governor Letcher had valid concerns about Western Virginia. The borders between Ohio and Pennsylvania were possible invasion routes. A 250-mile-long river border existed between Ohio and western Virginia. The industrial cities of Wheeling and Parkersburg were serviced by the B&O Railroad, which connected both cities with Baltimore and the Atlantic Ocean. The National Pike went through a large part of Pennsylvania and on to Wheeling, where it bridged the river into Ohio and beyond with a modern suspension bridge. A 125-mile-long open border existed between western Virginia and Pennsylvania. Morgantown was connected to the industrial city of Pittsburgh by the Monongahela River. Western Virginians conducted brisk trade with Ohio and Pennsylvania, and all used the Ohio River to trade and transport goods to cities and towns along the Mississippi River. Now, with the possibility of war, these borders could be used as an invasion route by armed forces on either side. One can only imagine what it was like living in western Virginia, eastern Ohio, and western Pennsylvania. Famous western Virginia orators John Carlisle and Waitman Willie were absent from the Clarksburg meeting when over 1,000 people assembled in the rain to learn about the Virginia Ordinance of Secession. Francis H. Pierpont rose to the occasion and in a 2-hour spellbinding speech declared the Virginia Ordinance of Secession invalid. He called for a meeting of the Western County delegates to be held in Wheeling on May 13th. The purpose? To debate what actions Western Virginians should take. Ohio Governor Dennison anticipated border problems with Virginia. He sought out George McClellan, a top-of-his-class West Point Military Academy graduate, hero of the Mexican War, successful businessman, and offered him a commission of Major General and the command of all the Ohio militia. McClellan accepted and immediately started training Ohio volunteers. When it was discovered that secessionist forces were being assembled in western Virginia, Major General McClellan quickly placed brigades of well-trained Ohio militia in Ohio towns across from Wheeling and Parkersburg. Pennsylvania quickly supplied its quota of militia to Lincoln. A.J. Sweeney, a Fayette County, PA resident and the protagonist in my book, wanted to be in the cavalry. He joined a cavalry company formed in Morgantown called the Kelly Lancers, which later became Company A of the 1st Virginia Cavalry Regiment, the one loyal to the Union. John Carlisle was perhaps the most eloquent speaker at the first Wheeling Convention held by delegates from the western counties. He took the floor many times to reply to previous speakers who wanted the convention limited to the adoption of paper resolutions and those who said any other actions would be revolutionary. Carlisle argued that western Virginia was already in revolution because of the usurpers in Richmond stealing the people's power to make their own decisions. He stated western Virginians were the only portion of Virginia not now under military despotism. But he warned orders from Richmond had already been given and were being executed, by which Westerners are to share the same fate that has been imposed on all portions of the state. He warned by saying, "No people ever remain free or ever will that were not willing to spill their last drop of blood for the maintenance of their liberty." Then he ended with a call to action. Show yourself worthy to be free. His speech is covered on page 103 of Storm Coming. In the referendum held on May 23, 1861, Virginia's secession was ratified by a large majority of the people of the state. But in the western counties, which would later form the state of West Virginia, the vote of the people was approximately 35,000 against ratification and 19,000 for ratification of the Ordinance of Secession. Shown in blue in this slide are the western Virginia counties that voted to approve Virginia's secession from the U.S. Once it was known that the people of Virginia ratified secession, McClellan acted quickly by sending Ohio militia to help Colonel Kelly and the 1st Virginia Infantry Volunteer Regiment drive out secessionist forces. The secessionists had destroyed bridges on the B&O Railroad from Grafton to Wheeling and Parkersburg. Colonel Kelly planned an envelopment maneuver to capture the secessionists. The resultant battle, the first of the Civil War, became known as Philippi Races because the secessionist forces outran the pursuing Union forces who had marched all night to get in position. Colonel Kelly was badly wounded in the battle and was widely reported as killed. He ultimately survived and was promoted to brigadier general. As a result of Virginia citizens voting for the Ordinance of Secession, the Second Wheeling Convention was held at the Wheeling Custom House on June 11, 1861. Here is a brief summary of the actions taken at the Second Wheeling Convention. A declaration of the people of Virginia was drafted by former state senator John S. Carlisle. The declaration stated the secession convention was falsely called by the Virginia legislature, not the people, and therefore all of its acts were illegal. The delegates passed an act to restore the government of Virginia because when Virginia seceded, it pulled its senators and representatives out of the U.S. Congress. Francis H. Pierpont was appointed governor of the restored government of Virginia. The restored government of Virginia then elected John Carlisle and Waitman Willie as U.S. senators and 5 others as U.S. representatives. All the Western statesmen were sent to Washington, where they were accepted into the U.S. Congress by the U.S. Congress and with the approval of the President of the United States. This acceptance by the U.S. government set the stage for later acceptance of West Virginia into the Union as a state. Stung by the defeat at Philippi and dragged over the coals by the Confederate press, Governor Letcher and General Lee created a new plan to take control of western Virginia counties and rid them of the federal soldiers. Lee's adjutant, Brigadier General Robert S. Garnett, was placed in charge. The Confederates blocked the Stanton to Parkersburg Turnpike at Rich Mountain and the road to Beverly from Grafton at Bellington. McClellan personally took charge of all forces true to the Union. One of the brigade commanders, General Rosecrans, flanked and defeated the fortress at Rich Mountain and captured most of the Confederate soldiers in the fort. Now in danger of being surrounded, General Garnett's forces at Bellington escaped during the night and started to retreat to Stanton. The Federals aggressively pursued and caught up with the retreating forces at Corricks Ford. There, General Garnett was killed. He was the first general officer killed in the Civil War. The federal Constitution does not allow a new state to be created out of an existing state unless the existing state's legislature and the U.S. Congress give consent. The legislature of the restored government gave approval for a new state named Kanawha to be formed out of the boundaries of Virginia. A month or so later, Kanawha was renamed West Virginia. The Second Wheeling Convention, which had taken a recess until August 6, 1861, reassembled on August 20, 1861, and called for a popular vote on the formation of a new state. It was approved by the people. A constitutional convention was then called to frame a new constitution for the proposed new state of West Virginia. With their attempts to rid Western Virginia of federal forces, a new plan was developed, and General Lee himself was ordered to Western Virginia to take charge. The Cheat Mountain Fortress was designed by the Federals to keep Confederate soldiers out of Western Virginia. It was a strong fortress and held a commanding position, but it was manned by only 350 Federal soldiers from Indiana. However, the Indiana commander, Colonel Kimball, was an aggressive commander who made a reputation for himself in the war with Mexico. General Lee now had available a whole division of about 6,000 men led by General Loring. The division was divided into 4 brigades, approximately 1,500 men in each brigade. Lee and Loring wanted to capture the Cheat Mountain Fort, and together they developed a rather complicated plan to do just that. They would surround the fort during the night with 3 brigades, while the 4th Brigade was positioned to attack the Federals fortified at Elkwater. The plan looked good on paper and even seemed to work when all 3 brigades were in position at the right time. But as complicated plans sometimes go, this one started falling apart when heavy fog set in and completely covered the mountain. Georgia General Rust, in charge of the brigade assigned to first attack the fort and give the cannonade signal for the other brigades to attack, got cold feet when he saw the fortress up close. He thought it looked menacing and concluded it would be suicidal to attack the fort. He gave no attack signal. Colonel Nathan Kimball, hearing the Confederates arguing among themselves, thought they were a scouting party. He blindly attacked with his 350 Indiana soldiers in the dense fog and chased off Rust and the other 2 Confederate brigades off the mountain. The 4th Brigade near Elkwater quit the field due to the weather. Lee was greatly embarrassed. He asked Governor Letcher not to mention this to anyone, as he would try again. General Rosecrans, now in charge of all Federal forces in Western Virginia after Major General McClellan was called to Washington, gathered his forces, and proceeded south. Lee followed in an attempt to block Rosecrans from moving east towards Lewisburg. The 2 forces were approximately the same size, and each force occupied separate ridges at Sewell Mountain. Both sides hoped the other would attack and be destroyed. Neither side had an advantage of position, so they sat on the two separate ridges and bombarded one another with cannons, but did little harm to each other. Persistent rains, sicknesses, and low supplies plagued both sides, who had already overextended their supply lines. Rosecrans finally realized they were at a stalemate and reasoned that if he pulled out, he would not only save his men, he would shorten his supply lines. Lee, if he followed, would have to lengthen his supply lines. Rosecrans departed one night under the cover of darkness. When Lee realized Rosecrans was gone, he also realized he had already extended his line of supplies to the breaking point. So Lee decided not to pursue Rosecrans and sent the Confederate forces under Loring back to Huntersville. No further serious offensive actions were mounted by the Confederates to retake the area of western Virginia. Lee withdrew the remaining Confederate forces to Lewisburg, where he received a telegram from President Davis recalling him to Richmond. A dejected Lee finally left the eastern Virginia mountains on October 30th and returned to Richmond. The Southern press was particularly hard on Lee, as you see here with the quotes. Perhaps the deepest cut of all was from the Richmond paper that labeled him Granny Lee. Western Virginians approved the ordinance to create a new state out of Virginia by a vote of 18,408 to 781. With the recall of General Lee from Western Virginia, General Kelly took temporary command of the newly formed U.S. Military Department of Cumberland, established to guard the P&O Railroad. General Kelly was an aggressive commander. He soon built up his forces, then attacked and defeated the Confederate forces in Romney. Kelly's force occupied the town. My book, Storm Coming, ends at the end of 1861. The second volume of the trilogy will cover the years of 1862 and 63. Obviously, the battle to create a new state didn't end in 1861. This slide provides a brief summary of the events leading up to the statehood. The most serious block to statehood took place in the U.S. Senate in the debate that lasted from June 26 to July 14, 1862. The Senate did pass the bill by a vote of 23 to 17, and the bill was sent to the President. The President hesitated until the last minute before signing the bill. He finally decided, saying, "We can scarcely dispense with the aid of West Virginia in this struggle, much less can we afford to have her against us in Congress and in the field. Her brave and good men regard her admission into the Union as a matter of life and death. They have been true to the Union under many severe trials. The division of a state is dreaded as a precedent, but a measure made expedient by war is no precedent for times of peace. It is said that admission of West Virginia is secession and tolerated only because it is our secession. Well, if we can call it by that name, there is still a difference enough between secession against the Constitution and secession in favor of the Constitution. The admittance of West Virginia to the Union represented a personal blow to Lee, Letcher, Davis, as well as the Confederacy. Virginia lost over a third of her territory, the only state to lose any territory during the Civil War. Perhaps all concerned realized the wily northwestern Virginia politicians had taken advantage of the chaos of war to do what they had always wanted to do for decades: secede from Virginia. Lincoln, in his speech approving the West Virginia statehood bill, said, "The division of a state is dreaded as a precedent." Was West Virginia statehood a precedent? Following the same process set forth in the U.S. Constitution, Massachusetts passed an enabling legislation in 1819, separating the District of Maine from the rest of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Maine became the nation's 23rd state on March 15, 1820. Over the years, many have questioned the legality of the formation of the state of West Virginia. The fact that the state still stands and yesterday celebrated its 155th year birthday is proof in itself that it was formed legally. The Supreme Court of the United States did rule in 1871 in the case of Virginia versus West Virginia, in which Virginia was suing West Virginia over the ownership of Berkeley and Jefferson counties. The court implicitly affirmed that the breakaway Virginia counties had received the necessary consent of both the state of Virginia and the United States Congress to become a separate state, and explicitly held that the counties of Berkeley and Jefferson were part of the new state of West Virginia.